So I haven't given you every randomized prospective clinical trial. I've given you one of the top three, and all three came to the same conclusions. And my point began to reiterate that if we think this is the highest standard of information, then we should follow it. We're going to look on to meta-analyses, and what meta-analyses do is a special technique of taking all the trials, whether they're randomized or they're observational studies, and putting them together as if they were all done as a single trial, and then reanalyzing the data. And so, for example, here is a recent meta-analysis that is highly relevant in many ways to this hearing. And the reason that it's relevant is it comes from Cape Town and the University of Stellenbosch. And also it was released within a short period before this trial, before I was called to this trial. And there were a lot of people knew about that it was present. And the question in my mind is, to what extent did this influence the preliminary committee to draw up the case against me? So we may develop that argument later or not, but it did come out just shortly before I was ordered to come before this committee. And the study obviously was took 2 or 3 years to do, and the ultimate conclusion was the following: that trials show weight loss in the short term, irrespective of whether the diet is low carbohydrate or balanced. There's probably, and I emphasize probably, but when you do a meta-analysis, you need to say whether there is or not a difference. There either is or there isn't. That's not a scientific term. There's probably little or no difference in weight loss and changes in cardiovascular risk factors up to 2 years of follow-up when overweight and obese adults with or without type 2 diabetes are randomized to low carbohydrate diets or what they call isoenergetic balanced weight loss diets. So when this diet came out, I was pretty certain it was attacking the Banting low carbohydrate movement, because that was the way I read it, and the way it was released to the media, and the fact that there were a whole bunch of South African organizations which were involved in it, and I don't remember all the details, but it wasn't as if it was just released by one research group. There were other organizations that involved themselves actively in the promotion of this study throughout the country. And so the question was, what is isoenergetic and what's balanced? And the question was this a low carbohydrate diet? And in fact, in our terms, it wasn't. It was a diet in which the carbohydrate intake was between 90 and 200 grams. That was the range of carbohydrates that were studied. And that ignores the fact that the low carbohydrate diet that we think is effective is between 25 and 50 grams. So this was looking at a population who were eating more carbohydrate than we would prescribe. And one of the key points is that the high-fat diet, low-carbohydrate diet works because it allows you to reduce your calories because it takes away your hunger. So they looked specifically at studies where the calorie intake was set to be the same. In other words, people on the low-carbohydrate diet who had less hunger were forced to eat more so that they could balance the high-carbohydrate diet. These people were eating more calories. So they obliterated the main effect of the low carbohydrate diet is that you actively reduce your calorie consumption because you're not hungry. And so I knew that there were many studies, meta-analyses, which showed an effect if you don't balance for calories. Because why would you want to balance for calories when the whole effect of the diet is that it reduces the calories? That a low carbohydrate diet is a low calorie diet by definition. That's a definition. Because if it affects your hunger, you reduce your calories. So this study is not designed to answer the question, is the Banting diet or the low carbohydrate diet more effective than a conventional diet? Because they've manipulated and looked at those studies where, in my view, the key effect of the low carbohydrate diet has been excluded. So you wouldn't expect there to be a difference. So that was a concern for me, that the studies seemed to be designed to favor the high carbohydrate diet because it took away the one strength of the low carbohydrate diet. And then this becomes one of the fundamental arguments about the low carbohydrate diet is, recall when I went on the diet, it was because Steve Finney and Westman and Volek wrote a book which said lose 6 kilograms in 6 weeks without hunger. And I said, that's impossible. Can't be true. And so the question is that the fallacy of the low-fat diet is that it doesn't cut hunger to the same extent as a low-carbohydrate diet does. And Gary Taubes, who wrote the book Good Calories, Bad Calories, wrote this editorial in the New York Times, not because he was attacking that study, but the argument would fit to argue against low-fat diets that force you to be hungry, to reduce your calories and at the same time induces hunger. And it's really interesting because he refers back to research done by Ansel Keys, who's the kind of the demon of the low-carb or the high-fat diets. And Ansel Keys did this study during the Second World War because they wanted to know what would happen when the war ended and suddenly they had to refeed people who had been starving for years. And the study was of human starvation that has never been done before and is completely unethical, could never be done again, but was ethical under the conditions. They describe what happens if you restrict calories. And that's how we try to tell people to lose weight. You must restrict calories. You've got to balance calories. You reduce your calories and you exercise more, and therefore you're burning away the calories and so on. And the reality is if you do that on a low-fat diet, most people will become very hungry. Not everyone, but the majority. So this is what Ansel Keys' work showed, that more troubling were the psychological effects. The men became depressed, lethargic, and irritable. They threw tantrums. They lost their libido. They thought obsessively about food day and night. The Minnesota researchers called this semi-starvation neurosis. 4 developed character neurosis. 2 had breakdowns, 1 with weeping, talk of suicide, threats of violence. He was committed to the psychiatric ward. So that's diet-induced psychosis. The personality deterioration of the other culminated in 2 attempts at self-mutilation. He nearly detached the tip of 1 finger and later chopped off 3 with an axe. When this period of self-imposed starvation ended, the subjects were allowed to refeed. At first, they were allowed to eat more calories, but restricted as to how much. A subset under continued observation was then allowed to eat to satiety, which was surprisingly hard to achieve, you see, because now their whole apostat's been affected by this starvation. The men consumed prodigious amounts of food, up to 10,000 calories a day. They regained weight and fat with remarkable rapidity. After 20 weeks of recovery, they averaged 50% more body fat than they had when they began. Post-starvation obesity, the researchers called it. So my point again is that we know this, and we know how difficult it is for people to go on low-calorie, low-fat diets. And this is the reason, because they become hungry. And hunger is not a sign of weakness of character and weakness of personality. It's a biological response that is built into our bodies for some or other reason. And if you mess around with it like this, that's the response you can expect. And so Gary Taubes writes this: implicit in many discussions of how best to lose weight is the assumption that hunger, which is a consequence of calorie deprivation, that is a given, is not an issue. We don't care if you get hungry, it's your problem, you must solve it. Health and government organizations tell the obese and overweight, who now make up just over 2/3 of our adult population, to do what the study is subject to: eat less, cut back on calories. That advice implies that the ensuing hunger will be easily bearable burden. No depression, no lethargy, no irritability, no tantrums, please. And bearable not just for 20 weeks, but for a lifetime. The Minnesota experiment tells us that when semi-starvation ends, the refeeding period will not end well, because on refeeding, you'll tend to increase body weight. And I have a colleague who spent his research career studying hunger. Asking people to eat less, he said, is like asking them to breathe less. And that's a very important point, because you have an apostat, and the apostat's going to drive you to eat. And no more can you breathe less than you can eat less than that apostat is telling you to do. It sounds reasonable so long as you don't expect them to keep it up for long. Much of the obesity research of the past century has focused on elucidating behavior techniques that could induce the obese to eat less, tolerate hunger better, and so, by this logic, lose weight. The obesity epidemic suggests it's failed. And again, that's my point, that we have conventional advice, hasn't worked. This is conventional advice. It doesn't work. The Minnesota experiment proves what the outcome will be if you tell people to starve. They will have to refeed eventually and they'll become fatter. And we can't continue ignoring the evidence as it is. So when the Stellenbosch meta-analysis came out, I didn't understand why it had to be done, because there had already been a number of meta-analyses of low-carb versus high-carb diets, and the low-carb diets always did extremely well. And at the time, there was this other paper, which had been reported in 2012. So this would have been 2012 when the Stellenbosch study was first planned. This study was always already in the literature. And this is a meta-analysis of 1,141 obese patients, showed that low carbohydrate diet to be associated with significant decreases in body weight, body mass index, abdominal circumference, systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, plasma triglycerides, fasting plasma glucose, glycated hemoglobin. Remember, those are all markers of insulin resistance, of plasma insulin, plasma C-reactive protein, that's a measure of inflammation, as well as an increase in high-density lipoprotein cholesterol. Remember, that's the one that's the so-called good cholesterol. And if you don't have a fatty liver and you reduce your carbohydrates, we know that it's going to rise. And they said low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, that's the so-called bad cholesterol, and creatine, and that's a measure of renal function, kidney function, did not change significantly, and there was limited data about what happened to uric acid. So this data showed that it was perfectly safe to suggest people should go on a low carbohydrate diet because you got all these benefits and there was no evidence for harm. And unfortunately, when the Stellenbosch study was presented, it was presented as evidence that the Banting diet is harmful. But it never showed that. It showed that there was no difference in the two diets. And that's how it should have been honestly presented. But it was presented as evidence that Noakes' Banting diet doesn't work, or it's dangerous. And that was never found in that study. And we had all this other evidence to suggest that the Banting diet was perfectly safe. Now, at the same time in 2012 that the Stellenbosch study was being done, there was this paper which was also available, and this was now a very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet. So this is a diet in which a carbohydrate was restricted to 25 to 50 grams, which is what we generally advise for people with pronounced insulin resistance. That this is a ketogenic diet and it's compared to a low-fat diet for long-term weight loss. And what did they conclude? So in the overall analysis, there were 5 measures or outcomes which revealed significant results. Individuals assigned to the very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet showed decreased body weight, reduced triglycerides. Remember, that's a specific effect of a low carbohydrate diet. Does diastolic blood pressure with increases in HDL cholesterol. But they also reported that LDL cholesterol rises. And if you think LDL cholesterol rises and causes heart disease, that would worry you. But I showed you that it's simplistic just to think of LDL cholesterol. You have to look at the small, dense LDL particles. So the individuals assigned to the very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet achieved a greater weight loss than those assigned to a low-fat diet in the long term. Hence, a very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet may be an alternative tool against obesity. So this is now 2013, again giving us comfort that this low carbohydrate diet, even if you restrict it below 50 grams, produces beneficial effects. That if those are sustained for life, we would expect a beneficial outcome. Now, I'm slipping from meta-analyses to single studies because I thought that this one example would be important because we're talking about ketogenic diets, that ketogenic diets have been raised. The topic of ketogenic diets has been raised in relationship to children. So this is a study also in the same year, 2012, in which they put obese children and adolescents on a highly carbohydrate restricted diet, which is ketogenic. And so this is doing what really we were here to debate. These people are put on a ketogenic diet and their children and adolescents. And they concluded that the ketogenic diet revealed more pronounced improvements in weight loss and metabolic parameters in the hypocaloric diet, and maybe, and I conclude, feasible and safe alternative for children's weight loss. So this is a single study suggesting that they find nothing to worry them when you put these children on this diet and even restrict the carbohydrates less than would be prescribed in, for example, our book Raising Superheroes, that it's still safe and it's effective. And I would argue that once you have children that are obese, they have established insulin resistance, and you have to treat them as if they have the metabolic syndrome and are insulin resistant. And then a very low carbohydrate diet would be expected to be beneficial, as it was for those anecdotal examples I gave you. Now we come right up to date. So we've had the Stellenbosch study in 2014, published 2014. We now come to the two most recent studies published a few months ago. And the first study comes from Harvard. And Harvard has not always been absolutely convinced that low carbohydrate diets are healthy. And Harvard has not been convinced that cereals and grains are not, they are convinced. They have been fairly persuasive in the argument that cereals and grains are critically healthy. So this now is beginning to show a slight shift at Harvard. And so amongst the authors are David Ludwig, who's just written a book, published like a month ago, and the title is, it's always hungry or getting rid of hunger, but the title includes the words hunger. He is a staunch advocate of the low carbohydrate diet and the way it treats hunger. Walter Willett is the most published nutritional scientist in the world. He's published over 3,000 publications. Many of them are associational observational studies. And I have a great argument with Dr. Willett that he has overinterpreted those data, and that they are the basis for the current dietary guidelines. He's influenced them hugely by doing associational studies and concluding that you can look from an associational study and identify single foods that will make you healthy or not. And I don't think that's correct. And Dr. Frank Hugh is also a leading scientist at Harvard. So they've done an effect of low-fat diet interventions versus other diet interventions on long-term weight change in adults, a systematic review, and this is published in The Lancet, which is one of the 2 or 3 best journals in the world. So remember, they're not just focusing on low carb versus low fat. They're looking at all dietary options. And the question that they will answer is the low-fat diet the ultimate, most successful, most healthy diet? Because that's what we are told today, that the low-fat diet is the ideal diet. And that's the question that they're addressing. So their interpretation is that these findings suggest that the long-term effects of low-fat diet intervention on body weight depends on the intensity of the intervention in the comparison group. Now what does that mean? What they found that when you do an intervention, you tend to favor the group that you're doing the intervention in. You tend to forget the other group, so you let them do what they ever do. And that's not fair, because the group that you intervene with has an advantage and is much more likely to get an outcome than the group that you just let and will just leave them. And what they're showing is that the difference in the effect is determined not by what happens in this group, it's how carefully you look after this group. And the more intervention you give into the control group, the less effect you measure. And unfortunately, we're all scientists, and we always favor our hypotheses. So we're always going to be biased towards the intervention, because we believe the intervention is going to bring an outcome. So we're going to focus on this group and make them do better, and we ignore this group. And that's his conclusion, that you have to look at studies where the intervention is equal. And when you look at studies where the intervention is equal, when compared with dietary intervention of similar intensity, evidence from randomized controls does not support the low-fat diet over other dietary interventions for long-term weight loss. In other words, the convention, which is that the low-fat diet is the best diet in the world and produce the best results and the greatest long-term weight loss, is not supported by the most recent meta-analysis coming from Harvard Medical School. They're not saying that the low carbohydrate diet is better, which I'd love them to say. They're not saying it. They're saying that the low-fat diet is not the best. It's not superior to the other diets. So we have lived with a convention for a long time, and we have to ask, are we going to accept what Harvard says, or are we going to continue to give advice that is based on there's only one diet and it's low fat and that's going to be the best? So this is a turning point, because I think Harvard are getting the message that they've been backing the wrong horse. And they backed the wrong horse in 1977 because they were critically involved in the development of the dietary guidelines in 1977. And now they're suddenly realizing, oops, all that work might have been taking us down the wrong road.